Hello lovely people, my name is Emma and today I'm going to be bringing you some recommendations for the Readathon Non-Fiction November. So Non-Fiction November is a reading initiative that happens every year focused on reading more non-fiction. There are 4 buzzwords each year and this year they are time, buzz, movement and discovery. And today I've got 3 books to recommend for each one of those little kind of subheadings. I'm also going to link down below as many of the non-fiction videos I can possibly think of that I've done previously, so if you're somebody who has a very specific subgenre of non-fiction that you're interested in, please do check it out down below. I've done one on quite a few different ones out there now, so it's definitely worth checking it out. But today we've got a real mishmash of different books to talk about, and most of them I've not raved about too much on this channel, I don't think, although it's now getting hard to tell. So let's talk about the buzzword of time first. And the first one I want to recommend is Roaring Girls by Kyte. I finished this book recently in the History Challenge and it was a really excellent read. It is the forgotten history of British feminists and it's about 8 individual women throughout British history who could be classed as feminists in some way, shape or form. Because it's 8 different women, it really is like a mini biography on each one, but you still get a surprising amount of information about them and you get a real nice kind of bouncing around within kind of different time periods within British history. So it's a nice sort of sweeping look if you're new to history as a kind of subgenre to read, or indeed British history in general. What I also really enjoyed about this book was it was very good at kind of opening up that discussion about how appropriate it is to use a term like feminism to talk about people historically when that terminology was not available for them at the time. Maybe what they're doing isn't actually strictly in line with feminism as you would take kind of a modern context. They're not necessarily advancing women's rights in any meaningful way. They are just women trying to survive and thrive in a world that is not set up for them. So it was a really interesting conversation about how anachronistic it can be to try and claim individuals from history for a particular social movement in the modern day. So the lens that we view history is really important. Another great book I wanted to recommend for time is We Were 8 Years in Power by Ta-Nehisi. I thought, you know, it's talking about the Obama administration and 8 specific years, so time is a fairly relevant topic for it. This is 8 individual essays that Ta-Nehisi wrote for, I believe, The Atlantic throughout kind of each year of the Obama administration, looking in some way at Obama and his administration through the lens of race as a black man. And what is really interesting about this book is I'm not really normally a big fan of like collections of essays because I don't think there's anything that holds them together particularly, but Ta-Nehisi has a chapter before each essay that is of him reflecting on the writing process, what he would change since then, kind of what was happening sort of throughout the US and the world at that time. And so it doubles almost like as a mini memoir at the same time as an essay collection. Incredibly powerful collection of essays, really some incredible stuff in here, and was just generally a really interesting read. I'm not normally one for reading like political non-fiction because I can find it very dense, but this was incredible as a reading experience and would totally recommend the audiobook as well. The final one I'm going to recommend for time is going way back in time to look at The Ends of the World by Brannen. This is about the 5 extinction events that Earth has faced in its time existing and sort of the lead up to them, how they happened and what happened to life afterwards. So a lot of people know about the extinction event of the dinosaurs and that is the last one, but a lot of people don't realise that there were 4 other major mass extinction events that happened beforehand. So this is a really great introduction to the range of kind of prehistoric paleontology that is out there, and is also excellent if, like me, you're a huge fan of dinosaurs anyway, and you get to find out about things like trilobites and the Cambrian period where everything went weird, and it is just generally really excellent. The end of the book and sort of interlaced throughout it, there are conversations about climate change and the fact that we could be in the beginning / potentially middle of a mass extinction event right now, but whether we should be as doom and gloom about that or not. So it's generally really interesting, and it's a great jumping off point if you're interested in paleontology but don't know exactly where you want to go. And he does name drop a whole bunch of really cool paleontologists who pretty much all of them have their own books anyway, so you can really use this to sort of broaden your horizons for that as a subgenre. Next we're going to move on to the topic of movement, and I've mainly gone for travel as the understanding of this particular buzzword. So the first one of these I wanted to talk about is Sea People by Christina Thompson. Yes, I got that right. Excellent. And this is in search of the ancient navigators of the Pacific, or indeed the puzzle of Polynesia, depending on which particular edition you're reading as to which subtitle. So this is a look at the history of the Polynesian people as they exist sort of across a variety of different islands in the Pacific. This kind of this huge big triangle where you can find different tribes of them. And it's not only a history of the Polynesian people in general, but also a history of other cultures' interactions with Polynesian people, and because of that almost like a history of sort of Western explorers and then colonizers, and the various ways that the different cultures have interacted, whether it be positively or negatively historically. It's also a nice history of how Western scientists have tried to understand Polynesian culture and how people got onto these islands before we kind of at the time understood technology to be available to do that, and the way that sort of things like anthropology as a study have sort of formed. It's generally a really cool book that is super multidisciplinary and is doing a lot of different very, very, very interesting things. So I would really heavily recommend it. It's a little bit denser than some of the stuff I've been talking about so far, but I think it's totally worth it, and the audiobook is super accessible. So it's just generally an amazing read all around. The next book I wanted to talk about is From Here to Eternity by Doughty. This is travelling the world to find the good death, and it's basically Doughty's experiences travelling to meet various different communities and cultures and looking at how they interact with death and the various death rituals that people have. Doughty has a YouTube channel called Ask the Mortician. She's a fantastic author who has 3 books out now, I believe. I've read 2 of them, and she is just generally a wonderful, wonderful writer who brings a lot of levity to a very serious topic. What she is sort of pioneering for is for Western culture to be better at interacting with the concept of death, which is something that we have to deal with in life and there's no getting away from it. So by exploring a lot of different cultures, she's looking at how different people interact with it and how we might find it really weird, but actually some of the other ideas that they have are probably healthier than the way that we currently deal with it. Generally really interesting and fascinating, and a great way of moving across the whole world. Look at that movement, including them all. The last book I want to recommend for movement is Prisoners of Geography by Tim Marshall. Yes, there we go. This is 10 maps that tell you everything you need to know about global politics. I don't really need to say much more than that, to be honest. Tim Marshall is looking at a really, really macro understanding of global politics and discussing how the geological features of various countries have managed to influence their sort of history and politics time and time again as to how they interact with other neighbouring countries. It's a huge macro look at the world and really helps to break down big global political movements. If, like me, you just get really, really lost when people start to talk about like major sort of economic players and that kind of thing. It's a little, not out of date now, but it was published a little while ago, so it's interesting to see how some of his predictions have played out. But I do think it's really accessible and is great if you are somebody who is interested in politics but has no idea what the news is talking about most of the time. So the next buzzword is buzz, and for that we are focusing pretty much exclusively on nature writing and just hoping that the book contains a few insects. That's how I'm doing that one. The first book I want to recommend is Waterfalls of Stars by Rosanne Alexander. I'm really bad at looking at the authors before I talk today, aren't I? So this is about a woman who lived on the island of Skoma for 10 years. She was one of the wardens of the island. It's a little island off the coast of the UK, and it has always like a couple who live on it, who their job is to, you know, work the lighthouse, keep an eye on the island, sort of keep track of various ecological things like the puffins and the seals, and just sort of generally be wardens and kind of around. It is completely remote, and she was also on it in the time before the internet. So we're talking about total isolation, but it's a lovely description of the nature that she gets to experience and that real time to kind of turn off and be away from general sort of society and community as a whole. It's beautiful and really interesting, and just an absolute solid if you do like nature writing in the slightest. And I do find nature writing is a very accessible way of getting into non-fiction, and it's also a very soothing kind of read. So if you've got almost like high anxiety about the world in general right now, this might be a balm for it, because it is really peaceful and relaxing, and you get to read about puffins and seals like all the time. It's an absolute winner. Something I know that definitely has a lot of things that go buzz is Extraordinary Insects by Sverdrup-Thygeson. This is, again, as it says on the tin, is about insects. A whole bunch of different ones. It's generally a really interesting book that is breaking down how insects work in a lot of different ways. Insects make up a huge proportion of the life on our planet. I think there are more beetle species than any other subgroup on the entire planet. And this book is looking at like the various different ways that they can kind of exist and interact, and you know, how do they have sort of social groups, what mating, their anatomy, etc, etc. It really is sort of a sweeping look, and it is surprisingly well organized given that huge range of topic, and it's also stunning. Like, look at that cover. So I totally recommend it if you are interested in nature but want something that's veering more towards the sciencey side of things than the kind of like pretty descriptions of nature side of things. And my final nature writing one is Wilding by Isabella. This is a memoir slash nature writing book in general, and it's about a woman who, her family owned a farm that was like an intensive farming practice, and then it no longer became financially viable for them to use it as farming, so they decided to give the land back to the wild, and it's about the rewilding project that they did on it. Rewilding is a very kind of buzzwordy sort of thing in conservation at the moment. It's something that can be a bit controversial for, depending on like how you approach it, but it's about Isabella Tree's like experiences in the process of rewilding, and then discusses some of the controversies and sort of the different movements around it and conservation as a whole. This book is really the one that opened up nature writing for me as something that I definitely really enjoyed reading, and it is a lovely blend of information about the science behind sort of rewilding and like ecosystems and how they work and kind of keystone species, but also some really wonderful descriptions of like otters frolicking and sort of wild horses, and also a conversation about farming in the UK and sort of farming practices across Europe and sort of the economics behind that of like how you feed a nation. So it's doing a lot of different things packed into one book, but it is wonderful. Also would heavily recommend the audiobook. Okay, for the final section we're going to be talking about discovery. The first book I want to recommend is Hidden Figures by Margot Shetterly. This is the untold story of the African American women who helped win the space race. It's got a movie made out about it now, which has only a couple of white saviour moments, so generally not too bad as far as movies go. But this is the true story of the African American women who worked for NASA, and actually for what was before NASA, which was to do with pilots and like the aircraft sort of schemes within the US for World War II. And it's about their various contributions to put a man in space, and sort of the sort of unsung things that they were doing behind the scenes. It's a really interesting look at America, the history of the space race, the history of World War II, the history of race relations in America. Generally this book is doing a lot, and it's kind of focusing on 3 or 4 sort of major women as it's going through it. I think this is perfect for discovery because these women's contributions to science remained undiscovered for a very long time, and it was only when Margot Shetterly decided to investigate it as somebody who has come from that community that she really could bring a real light to them. So it is an excellent read. The next book I want to recommend is Humankind, A Hopeful History by Rutger Bregman, and this is about rediscovering humanity in general and sort of really critically analysing the various interpretations we've had of humankind and like how we got to where we are now. There's a real tendency to view humankind in sort of the general common knowledge as being like it's dog eat dog and survival of the fittest, and that's how we've got to where we are today. But Rutger Bregman is putting forward an argument that actually it is our ability to empathise and be compassionate with one another, which is exactly why we've done so well. He looks at some real landmark cases in history, psychology, archaeology and anthropology that originally suggested that we were cutthroat species who are willing to throw each other under the bus to survive, and actually says, hey, a lot of that information is wrong, and here is a new way of rediscovering this information that shines us in a far more positive light. The final sort of third to quarter of the book is looking at how that can go wrong, because obviously we're not denying that humans can't do terrible things, but it is generally, like the subtitle suggests, a more hopeful look at humankind and a look to the future of how we can make things better. It looks really chunky. A lot of this is footnotes and like an index and sort of bibliography. Please don't be put off by it. It is one of the best books I've read this year. And the final book I wanted to talk about is Into the Deep by author who I can't remember. I'm sorry. It will be here and in the description box. I forgot to look that up. And this is the story of a cave diver. So the author is a highly experienced cave diver who's worked for things like the National Geographic, and it's about her time getting into cave diving and also sort of what the the process and career of a cave diver is like, and then looking at some of her major dives throughout her career. So she is somebody who has discovered places on the planet that literally nobody else has been to before, and she's also been cave diving inside of an iceberg, which is absolutely insane to think about. It's a really lovely blend of some sort of technical science talking about how human beings can survive underwater for such a long time, as well as obviously the memoir element of it, and some fairly nice descriptions of nature. But cave diving is fairly dark, so if you're expecting lots of like lovely descriptions of sort of beautiful coral reefs, wrong book for you. But I found it really, really interesting, and again, I would totally recommend the audiobook. It is, I believe, narrated by her and is excellent either way. So that is it from me for recommendations. Like I said, there is going to be tons of links down below, and please do check out my channel if you are looking for more non-fiction recommendations. I have quite a few out now, so plenty of stuff for you to look through. Are you joining in with Non-Fiction November, and have any of these made it onto your TBR because of anything I've said here? Do let me know in the comments down below. Have a wonderful reading week, and I'll chat to you soon. Bye!